Okay, we're here with Ted Davis, and he's going to tell us a little bit about some key important things for us to know.
I think that the history of science may be the most important field for understanding the relationship between science and religion. More important even than the sciences, or theology, or philosophy, or even biblical studies. The reason I say that is because of the prevalence of the cultural myth of a historical warfare between science and religion. This dominates much of the modern conversation, especially the conversation as defined by people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, many science journalists as well. According to this view, there's an ongoing inevitable conflict between religion and science. Science is winning, and religion is about to become obsolete and then extinct. This is called the warfare view of science and religion. In fact, the warfare view is false historically. The history of science and religion is not characterized by ongoing inevitable conflict between two contending powers that have clearly defined sides, as in a military combat. Rather, it's much more complex than that. It's not characterized by ongoing harmony. It's not characterized by ongoing warfare. There's no single conceptual model that accurately describes the history of science and religion. Sometimes people like to refer to what they call the complexity thesis, the idea that the history of science and religion is simply too complex to be described by any single metaphor, such as warfare or harmony. But the complexity thesis isn't really much of a thesis historically. It's simply the claim that the actual history is very messy, very complex. Now, it's important to understand what we mean by this. We're not really historians who look at science and religion in a serious way realize that conflicts with a small c have sometimes taken place, episodes that really could be described as conflicts between science and religion. But they're not the norm. Most of the relationship between science and religion historically is not described at all by conflict. It would be described by something else, some other kind of influence, or parallel development. Harmony sometimes, complementarity other times, irrelevance sometimes, parallel development. Many other kinds of things have happened. So if the historians of science and religion understand this, but many practitioners of science and many science journalists don't get the message. There aren't very many historians of science, and our low visibility may be part of it. But it also could be that when one looks at some contemporary issues, such as, for example, the clash between a Richard Dawkins on the one hand and a Henry Morris or Ken Ham on the other hand, that really does look like a conflict between science and religion. In fact, of course, it's a conflict between one particular way of viewing the world that Henry Morris and Ken Ham have, one that is closely attached to a type of religion, and a conflict between one particular way of viewing the world that's attached to another kind of religion, namely to atheism. That would be Richard Dawkins' worldviews between science and religion per se. It's a conflict of worldviews. So it's good to try to set the record straight historically and get a much more accurate history of science and religion, because in doing that, we can debunk the ongoing cultural myth of an ongoing historical warfare. That's the reason history of science has a key role to play here, because the great cultural myth of our time about science and religion, which is false, can really only be adequately debunked by providing a new history of science and religion. And that's the kind of work I try to do.
Any important resources to refer to?
Well, if a person wants to learn about this, there's a number of places you can go. Some places you can go are on the web, which is helpful. The website counterbalance.org is especially useful for looking at a more accurate history of science and religion. The ASA website, asa3.org, has a lot of good historical material on it. And the website of the Faraday Institute in the UK has a lot of good historical material on it. Bottom line here is that what we need is a more accurate history of science and religion. And that is ipso facto going to be friendlier to religion than the warfare thesis is. It will be more accurate, and it will debunk the warfare thesis. So that's a good result.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
What are some key books that you would recommend on this subject?
For people who aren't scholars themselves, I think perhaps the best place to look for an overall view of the history of science and religion that's much more accurate would be a recent book from Harvard University Press, a book called Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion. The editor of that book, Ronald Numbers, is the leading historian of science and religion in the United States. It contains 25 chapters, each written by a different person who's a specialist in the particular historical question, and it deals with such things as, for example, the very prevalent myth that Christians believed in a flat earth and that Columbus had made his voyage partly to prove that the earth was round. Neither of those things is true. Columbus didn't make his voyage in any way to prove that the earth is round. Everybody knew it was, and medieval Christians did not believe in a flat earth. That's such a very prevalent myth. You still continue to find this in elementary school textbooks, but it has no basis in fact at all. Another myth that many people have heard about is the idea that Isaac Newton believed in the clockwork universe and helped to originate the metaphor of clockwork universe. And that's not true either. Isaac Newton did not think in those ways about the world. He even denied that the world is God's watch, as he put it to Leibniz one time. So these kinds of mythologies can build over time. And when you have a lot of mythologies put together, you can help erect a much bigger mythology, the mythology of a historical warfare between science and religion that's ongoing and inevitable. Another good book that people can look at, which is somewhat intermediate between being aimed at scholars and aimed at the ordinary person, would be a book called When Science and Christianity Meet, edited by David Lindbergh and Ronald Numbers. Many other books exist, but they tend to be a bit more scholarly. In terms of Galileo, many people find Davis Sobel's biography of Galileo, called Galileo's Daughter, a very, very fun book to read. Even though it's fairly lengthy, it's beautifully written, very accurate. And reading that, you get a sense of the complexity of the situation that Galileo found himself in. And even, to some extent, you can get a sense of the role he himself had in creating some difficulties for himself. I recommend that one. That's a good way of debunking the idea that Galileo simply fell afoul of a church that was out to get him. The complexities in which he found himself are much better shown in that book.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.